I woke up with a stiff neck and the smell of old wood in my nose. It was my grandmother's farmhouse, the one outside Hazard we were supposed to be fixing up to sell. I'd brought my nephew Caleb down with me the night before, and the quiet was the first thing I noticed. No city traffic, no neighbors, just the hollow pressing in around the place. I pulled on my boots and went out the back door. The morning air was cool and damp, the kind that sticks to your skin. I'd set a saucer of buttermilk out on a flat gray stone in the garden the evening before, right in the middle of a ring made of river rocks and upright slate slabs. It was something my Grandma Ruby had always done. A family thing, she'd said, a way to say thanks. I'd figured I'd keep it up while we were here. The stone was out of the ring. Not just knocked loose, but levered up and flipped onto its side in the grass. Two of the slate slabs were cracked clean through, the pieces kicked into the weeds. The river rocks were scattered like someone had punted them, and the saucer I'd left full, was bone dry and licked clean. Not a drop left. It gleamed in the weak morning light, polished. A few feet away, there was a half-dug fire pit in the soft dirt. A mattock was stuck in the ground beside it. Caleb's work. He'd been clearing brush, he'd said. Wanted a fire. I found him inside, slumped at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal. "What happened to the garden?" I asked. He shrugged, not looking up. "What garden?" "The stone ring, out back. It's torn up." "Oh, that." He took a loud bite. "I was clearing some of that junk out. Wanted to see if I could get a fire going. The stone was in the way." "You moved it?" "Yeah, it was heavy." "And the saucer?" He finally looked at me, his face blank. "What saucer?" "The one I put out there last night. On the stone." He shrugged again. "Must have been an animal or something. Licked it clean." "There's no dog here, Caleb. You know that." "Raccoon, then. I don't know." I stood there for a second, looking at him. The saucer had been sitting on this counter before I took it out. Cold, full, untouched. Now it was out there shining like it had been through a dishwasher. An animal didn't do that. An animal would have knocked it over, left tracks. The grass around the ring was undisturbed. I didn't say anything else. I went to the pantry, thinking I'd get more buttermilk, try to make sense of it later. That's when I saw the card. It was taped to the inside of the pantry door, yellowed with age. The writing in a shaky cursive I recognized as Ruby's. It said, "Place a saucer of buttermilk and a spoonful of honey on the flat stone every Sunday at dusk. Say thank you aloud." Underneath, it said, "Feeding the porch people." I remembered that phrase from when I was a kid. The porch people. It was a family joke, something we'd say when a cookie went missing or a door creaked. Must be the porch people. We'd laugh. It was never real. Beneath the instruction, there were 3 names, each with a date next to it. All Alexanders. All from before I was born. I took the card off the door and carried it to the kitchen phone. My hands felt cold. Ruby's voice on the other end was thin, stretched by distance and the bad line. "Bernard, everything all right?" "The stone ring in the back garden," I said. "It's broken. The gray stone's out of the circle, and the saucer I put out last night is empty. Clean." There was a long silence. Then, "Empty?" "Dry as a bone, like something drank it." Her breath hitched, a sharp little sound. "Listen to me. You put that stone back, exactly where it was. You hear me? Exactly. And you fill that saucer again, not on Sunday, every night. You do it every night from now on." "Grandma, what?" "And you keep that boy out of that garden after dark. No one stands inside that ring after dark. No one." "Who are the porch people?" I asked. "The card says..." "They keep the weight even," she cut in, her voice dropping. "And they're short now. You understand? They're short." "What does that mean?" But she wouldn't say. She just repeated herself, the same instructions, her words tumbling over each other. "Put the stone back. Fill the saucer every night. Keep Caleb out after dark." Then she hung up. I stood there with the dead phone in my hand. the card crumpling in my grip. Caleb was watching me from the table. "What did she say?" he asked. "We're fixing the garden," I said. I spent the next couple of hours out there. The gray stone was heavy, and my back protested as I wrestled it back into the center of the ring. I gathered the river rocks, trying to remember how they'd been arranged. The two cracked slate slabs were the problem. They wouldn't stand upright anymore. They listed to the side, leaving gaps in the circle. I packed mud around their bases, but they just slumped over again. The ring was broken. Incomplete. When I was done, sweat sticking my shirt to my skin, I called Caleb over. "This garden is off limits after sunset," I told him. "You hear me? You don't come out here after dark." "Why?" "Because I said so." He gave me that teenage look, the one that says you're being weird, but he didn't argue. That evening, as the lights started to go gold and long, I went back to the pantry. The honey in the jar was clear and golden. I scooped out a spoonful, mixed it with buttermilk in a clean saucer, and carried it outside. I felt stupid. I said thank you to the empty air, my voice sounding flat and hollow in the quiet. I placed the saucer on the gray stone. Caleb had followed me out. He leaned against the door frame, watching. "What's that for?" he asked. "Tradition," I said. "Looks like you're feeding ghosts." "Porch people," I corrected without thinking. He snorted. "Yeah, sure. Terrifying." But later, after I'd washed up and he'd gone to bed, I found him standing in the pantry. He had the card in his hand. "These names," he said, his voice quiet. "Halloran, all of them. They're not Alexander's." I took the card from him. He was right. I hadn't looked closely before. The 3 names listed under the instruction. They were Hallorans, a name I'd heard in old family stories. Relatives who died young, long ago. "They all died before you were born," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. I didn't have an answer. I took the card and taped it back inside the pantry door. We didn't talk about it again. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water, watching the moon through the window over the sink. It was nearly midnight when I saw movement. Caleb. He was outside, barefoot, walking across the wet grass toward the garden. His eyes were open, but they had that blank, unfocused look. Sleepwalking. He walked right into the ring, straight to the center where the gray stone sat. He stopped and his lips started moving, whispering. I couldn't hear the words. Then I saw the mud move. The 2 broken halves of the slate slab, the ones I couldn't get to stand up, were pressing upward from the ground, not falling over, rising, lifting themselves out of the dirt as Caleb whispered to them. I bolted for the back door, but my hand went to the window instead. I tried to slide it up, to call his name, to break whatever was happening. The latch was cold under my fingers. I shoved it. It didn't budge. I shoved again, putting my shoulder into it. Nothing. It was locked or stuck or something was holding it shut. I watched, helpless, as Caleb finished whispering. He turned, slow and dreamlike, and stepped out of the ring. The moment his bare foot cleared the river rocks, the latch gave under my hand. The window slid up with a shriek of old wood. "Caleb!" I yelled into the night. He didn't turn. He just kept walking, back toward the house, back toward his bed, as if none of it had happened at all. The latch gave under my hand and the window slid up with a shriek, but by the time I got my head out into the night air, he was already walking back toward the house. He moved slow, dreamlike, his bare feet pale against the dark grass. I called his name, but he didn't turn. He didn't even flinch. He just climbed the back steps, opened the screen door, and disappeared inside. I stood there with my hands on the sill, the night air cool on my face, listening. The house was quiet. No creak of the floorboards, no door closing. Nothing. I waited a minute, maybe 2, before I pulled the window down and latched it again. My hands were shaking. I wiped them on my jeans. I didn't go check on him. I don't know why. I just sat back down at the kitchen table and watched the moonlight on the linoleum until it started to gray with dawn. I found him a little after 6, curled up on the porch swing. He was wrapped in the old quilt from the hall closet, his shaggy hair sticking to his forehead with dew. He was sleeping hard, the kind of deep sleep where the breath comes slow and even. I nudged his shoulder. "Caleb." He stirred, blinked up at me. His eyes were foggy, confused. "What? What are you doing out here?" He pushed himself up on his elbows, looked around at the porch, the gray morning light. "I don't know. You don't remember coming outside?" He shook his head, rubbing a hand over his face. "No, I was in bed." I pulled the quilt back. He was still in his sweats and a t-shirt. His feet were bare, dirty from the grass, and around both ankles, just above the bone, were rings of small, pressed marks. They weren't bruises. They were too uniform for that. A perfect circle of faint indentations, like something with many small, even teeth had held him there. "What are those?" I asked. He looked down, frowned. "I don't know. Poison ivy, maybe, from yesterday." "Poison ivy doesn't make circles." He shrugged, pulling his feet up under him. "It itches." I left him there and walked out to the garden. The air was still damp and cold. The saucer sat on the flat gray stone in the center of the ring, right where I'd left it. But it wasn't empty. It was full of something dark and thick, like molasses, and it was bubbling. Not boiling, just a slow, steady simmer of tiny bubbles breaking the surface. I'd put cold buttermilk in that saucer last night. This wasn't buttermilk. It was warm to the touch when I picked it up. It smelled sweet and rotten, like overripe fruit left in the sun. I carried it back to the house, my stomach tight. Caleb was still on the swing, scratching at his ankle. "Come inside," I said. "Get cleaned up." I washed the saucer at the kitchen sink with scalding water and dish soap. The dark liquid left a sticky, brownish residue in the basin that took 3 passes to scrub away. After, I went to the mudroom and opened the metal tool cabinet. The 2 broken halves of the slate slab were where I'd left them, leaning against the wall. I took them out, wrapped them in an old feed sack, and shoved them to the back of the cabinet behind a stack of paint cans. Then I locked the cabinet and put the key on my key ring. Caleb came into the kitchen while I was drying my hands. He'd washed his feet, but the marks were still there. "You moved the slate," he said. It wasn't a question. "It's put away." "Why?" "Because I don't want you touching it again." "I didn't touch it last night," he said, his voice edging toward that defensive rasp. "I told you. I don't remember going out there." "You were in the garden. I saw you." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Well, I don't remember. Maybe I was sleepwalking." "You were whispering, to the ground." That got him. His eyes flicked away toward the window. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "I had a dream." "About what?" "About doors. Little doors, under the dirt. Opening." He shifted his weight, and something was counting, like tallying something up. It sounded impatient. I tossed the dish towel over the back of a chair. "It was a dream, Caleb. You were upset about the argument. Your brain cooked it up." "Yeah," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Sure." After breakfast, I went back out to the ring. The morning sun was higher now, sharp and clear. I walked the perimeter slowly, looking for tracks. Deer, raccoon, dog, anything. The grass around the stone was smooth, undisturbed. No prints in the soft dirt of the half-dug fire pit. No scuff marks near the river rocks. It was as if nothing living had come within 10 feet of that saucer. But the soil inside the 2 openings where the slate slabs had been, the gaps in the ring, was different. It was packed down smooth and hard, like it had been pressed from beneath. The loose soil everywhere else was just that. Loose. Those 2 spots looked like plugs. Like something had come up from below and sealed them shut from the inside. I stood there for a while, just looking at it. The broken circle, the smooth plugs, the absolute quiet of the garden. Then I went inside to call Ruby. The phone rang a long time before someone picked up. A woman's voice, brisk and professional. Shady Grove Care Home. "I need to speak to Ruby Alexander," I said. "I'm sorry, Mr. Alexander. She's asleep right now. She had a restless night. Can I take a message?" I hesitated. "Tell her Bernard called. Tell her the signs in the garden are naming Caleb now. Tell her I'm taking him back to Cincinnati before dark if the road's open. I'll let her know." I hung up and stared at the phone. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the quiet. It was just past 10. Around 11, I went to the pantry to get a can of beans for lunch. That's when I saw the honey. The jar was on the shelf where it always was, but the honey inside wasn't golden anymore. It was black, thick as tar, and it had separated into gloopy layers. I'd used that jar yesterday morning. It had been fine. I took it down, unscrewed the lid. The smell hit me first. Cloying, fermented, wrong. I screwed the lid back on and set it on the floor. Then I looked at the card taped to the inside of the door. The 3 Halloran names were still there, with their old dates, but beneath them, in a cramped, angular script I didn't recognize, was a new line. Caleb Alexander, Sunday, October 27th, even weight. The date was today's. My hand went cold. I pulled the card off the door, the tape tearing the yellowed paper at the corner. I carried it to the kitchen phone and dialed Ruby's number again. This time she answered on the second ring. Her voice was thin, frayed. "Bernard?" "The card," I said, my own voice coming out rough. "There's a new line on the card. It says Caleb's name, and today's date, and it says even weight." I read it to her, word for word. She was silent for so long I thought the line had gone dead. Then I heard a slow, shaky exhale. "They've marked him." "What does that mean, Grandma? What is this ring?" "It's a boundary," she said, the words dropping like stones. "The food is rent. The slate slabs are openings for the porch people." "And when the ring is broken?" "When it's broken, the rent's not paid. The balance is off. They take a living member of the household to make the count even." Her voice broke on the last word. "I've kept the offering for 40 years, Bernard. 40 years every Sunday, to keep that payment from coming due." The 3 names on the card, Hallorans. The people listed, they weren't family losses, were they? "No," she whispered. "They were the payments, the ones who came before I took over the duty. I called them family so you wouldn't ask, so you wouldn't have to know." The kitchen felt suddenly airless. And the new line, Caleb? He broke the ring. He stood in the center. They've tallied him. The porch people will begin collecting when storm darkness falls over the hollow on Sunday. I looked at the clock. It was 12:25. Sunday. Today. "What does that mean?" I asked, but I already knew. "It means they'll come up through the openings," she said, her voice barely audible now, "and they'll take him down to even the weight." I hung up the phone. The receiver clicked into the cradle, a final, hollow sound. I stood there in the kitchen for a second, the words, "They'll take him down," echoing in the quiet. The clock over the stove said 12:30. Sunday. Today. I turned around. Caleb was leaning against the pantry doorframe, watching me, his arms crossed tight over his chest. "We're leaving," I said. My voice came out flat, matter of fact. "Right now. Go pack your clothes. Anything you brought down here." "What? Why?" "Because we are. Get moving." I didn't wait for another question. I went down the hall to the room I'd been using. My duffel was on the floor by the bed, still mostly unpacked. I yanked the zipper open and started shoving things inside. Jeans, flannels, socks. My wallet and phone were on the nightstand. I grabbed them, stuffed them into my front pocket. The truck keys jingled in my hand, cold and familiar. Caleb appeared in the doorway. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. Get your stuff." What about the house? The sale? I stopped packing and looked at him. He was 16, skinny in his hoodie, his face pale under the shaggy hair. He looked like a kid. He was a kid. The sale of this old place, the money, the whole reason we'd come down here, it didn't weigh anything next to that. Forget the house, I said. It doesn't matter. Keeping you alive matters. Now pack. He stared at me for another second, then turned and disappeared into his room. I heard his dresser drawers sliding open, the thump of his own bag hitting the floor. I finished with my duffel, zipped it shut, and carried it out to the kitchen. I set it by the back door. Caleb came out a minute later, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He hadn't changed his clothes. He was still in the sweats and t-shirt from last night, the same dirty bare feet. The rings around his ankles were faint but visible, little pressed marks in a perfect circle. Shoes, I said. I don't know where they are. Find them. That heavy teenage sound, and shuffled back toward the hall. I went to the mudroom, unlocked the tool cabinet. The wrapped halves of the slate were still there, behind the paint cans. I left them. I took the mattock instead, the one from the garden, and carried it out to the truck. The sky was a flat, uniform gray, the air still and heavy. It felt like waiting. I loaded the mattock into the bed, then went back for our bags. Caleb was standing in the kitchen tying his sneakers. He'd put on a pair of jeans. Let's go, I said, picking up his backpack and my duffel. I didn't look back at the house. I walked straight out the back door, across the porch, down the steps to the gravel driveway. The truck was where I'd parked it when we arrived, an old Ford with a dent in the passenger side fender. I tossed the bags into the cab, then went around to the driver's side and unlocked my door. Caleb hadn't moved from the bottom step. Get in, I said, sliding behind the wheel. He didn't. He just stood there, looking at the truck, then back at the house. His face was blank, confused. Caleb. Now. I can't, he said. His voice was quiet, almost wondering. What do you mean you can't? I mean I can't get in the truck. He shook his head like he was trying to clear it. I don't know why. It just feels wrong. Heavy. Like the garden does. I put the key in the ignition but didn't turn it. I got back out of the truck and walked around to where he was standing. Look, this isn't a discussion. Whatever you're feeling, it doesn't matter. We're leaving. Get in the passenger seat. I'm trying, he said, and he sounded scared now, the sarcasm gone. My feet won't move. I didn't have time for this. I grabbed him by the arm, above the elbow, and pulled him toward the truck. He stumbled, resisting, but I was bigger and I was done talking. I opened the passenger door, practically lifted him, and pushed him into the seat. He didn't fight, not really. He just went limp, like all the fight had drained out of him the second I touched him. I slammed the door shut, the sound sharp in the quiet yard. I got back in, turned the key. The engine grumbled to life. I put it in reverse, back down the long driveway to the gravel county road. The farmhouse shrank in the rearview mirror, a gray shape against the darker woods. I turned us toward Hazard, toward the main road, toward Cincinnati. The plan was simple. Get to the low water crossing, get over it, get to town before the weather hit. The radio had mentioned a chance of storms in the afternoon. I glanced at the sky again. The gray was thicker now, tinged with green at the edges. We'd been driving maybe 15 minutes, the trees closing in on both sides of the narrow road, when the first rumble of thunder rolled through the hollow. It wasn't distant. It was right on top of us, a deep, cracking sound that seemed to come from the ground. The rain started a second later. Not a drizzle, but a sudden, hard downpour that hammered the roof of the cab and turned the windshield into a blur. I flicked the wipers on high. They slapped back and forth, clearing momentary arcs of visibility. The road ahead was a shiny black ribbon, water already sheeting across the low spots. I slowed down, my hands tight on the wheel. The crossing came up faster than I expected. It was just a dip in the road where the creek ran over a concrete slab, usually no more than an inch or two deep. Not today. The water was brown and swift, already spreading across the road in a wide, shallow fan. It looked 6 inches deep, maybe more. I stopped the truck about 20 feet back. Damn it. We can't go through that? Caleb asked, his first words since we'd left. Not sure. I put the truck in park but kept it running. I've seen it worse, but with more rain coming. As if on cue, a brilliant fork of lightning lit up the woods to our left. The thunder that followed was instantaneous, a deafening crash. I saw movement in the rearview mirror, a shudder in the trees lining the road behind us. Then a sound like a gunshot, and a big hardwood, its roots undermined by the rushing water in the ditch, leaned slowly, gracefully, and fell across the road. It landed with a ground-shaking thud, its crown of branches blocking our way back. We were boxed in. Okay, I said, mostly to myself. Okay, we go forward. I put the truck back in drive and crept toward the water. The front tires dipped into the flow. The water pushed against them, but the truck kept going. We were halfway across the concrete slab when the engine coughed. It was a wet, choking sound. Then it died. The sudden silence was louder than the storm. The wipers stopped mid-swipe. The dash lights went out. I turned the key. Nothing. Not even a click. No, I muttered. I turned it again. Nothing. The water was rising. I could see it creeping up the doors outside. It was clear now. We weren't going to Hazard. The only place we could reach was the one we'd just left. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. No signal, not one bar. The hollow had always been a dead zone. I looked at Caleb. Your phone. It's charging, in the house. Of course it was. I shoved my useless phone back into my pocket and opened my door. Water surged in, cold and shocking, soaking my jeans to the knee. Come on, we're walking. Through that? The water's getting deeper. We go back up the road, around the tree. I came around to his side, opened his door. The current tugged at my legs. Now, Caleb. He climbed out, grimacing as the water hit his sneakers. I took his arm again, more for balance than force, and we waded back toward the road we'd come down. The fallen tree was massive, a tangle of wet leaves and broken branches. We had to scramble over the trunk, slipping on the wet bark. On the other side, the road was clear, just streaming with runoff. We started walking. The rain had eased to a cold, steady drizzle, but the sky was still dark as twilight. It took us the better part of an hour to cover the distance back to the farmhouse, our clothes soaked through, our shoes squelching with every step. Neither of us spoke. The house looked the same, empty, quiet, waiting. We went in through the back door. The kitchen was dim, the only light the gray gloom from the windows. I went straight to the landline phone on the wall. The message light was blinking, a single red eye in the shadows. I pressed the button. Ruby's voice filled the quiet kitchen, thin and strained. Bernard, it's me. I tried your cell. It went to voicemail. Listen. The home. They can't send anyone. Not in this weather. Not for what I told them. They think I'm confused. I'm not. You need to understand. The offering, it can delay them. It can buy you a little time. But it can't erase the debt. Once the name is on the card, the balance is set. You can't run from the weight, Bernard. You can only try to hold it off. The message ended with a soft beep. I stood there, the receiver in my hand, listening to the dial tone hum. Delay, not erase. Buy time. I hung up the phone. Caleb was sitting at the kitchen table, head in his hands. He looked exhausted. What did she say? He asked, his voice muffled. Nothing helpful. I walked to the window and looked out at the back garden. The ring was a dark smudge in the wet grass, the gaps where the slate had been like missing teeth. A thought solidified, hard and practical. If the offering could buy time, then the ring had to be up to take it. A broken boundary couldn't hold anything back. I turned from the window. I'm going outside. Why? To fix the garden. I went back out into the drizzle. The air was cold now. The storm darkness Ruby had warned about settling over the hollow like a lid. I started with the river rocks, the ones Caleb had kicked into the weeds. I gathered them one by one, my back protesting as I bent and straightened, carrying them to the edge of the ring and dropping them into place. The pattern came back to me. The larger, flatter rocks alternating with the smaller, rounder ones. It was slow, muddy work. When the rocks were back in a rough circle, I got the mattock from the truck. I used it to clear the thick, clotted mud from around the base of the flat gray stone, then from the 2 openings where the slate slabs had been. The dirt there was still packed hard, those smooth plugs. I chopped at them until they were loose, until the holes were deep and clean. Then I went to the mudroom. I unwrapped the 2 broken halves of the slate from the feed sack. They were heavy, awkward to carry. I took them out to the garden, one at a time, and fitted them into the holes I'd cleared. They didn't want to stand. They listed inward, the cracked edges not meeting, leaving a V-shaped gap between them. I packed mud around their bases, fistfuls of cold, wet earth, tamping it down with my boots. They held, but only just. They felt precarious, temporary. I stood back, wiping my muddy hands on my jeans. The ring was closed. Not perfect, not whole, but closed. The gray stone sat in the center, dark with rain. It looked like a boundary again. A shaky one, but a boundary. The light was failing fast. I went inside, straight to the pantry. The jar of honey was on the shelf. I took it down. The honey inside was mostly black, a thick, tarry sludge that had separated into gloopy layers. But at the very bottom, beneath the corruption, was maybe a tablespoon of clear, golden honey, still untouched. I scooped it out with a spoon, careful not to touch the black stuff. It smelled sweet, normal. I got a clean saucer from the cupboard, poured in fresh buttermilk from the carton in the fridge, and stirred in the honey. The mixture was pale, flecked with gold. I carried it outside. The garden was deep in shadow now. The storm darkness was complete, a purple gloom that made the trees look like cutouts. I walked to the ring, stepped carefully over the river rocks, and placed the saucer on the flat gray stone. My voice sounded small in the heavy air. Thank you. I didn't know who I was talking to. The porch people. The weight. The hollow itself. I just said it. And then I stepped back out of the circle, my boots sinking into the mud. I left the offering there, a little island of white in the gathering dark, and went back inside to wait. I stood in the mudroom for a second, dripping on the floorboards, and peeled off my soaked shirt. My skin was cold and goose-fleshed. I grabbed a dry flannel from the hook, buttoned it up, and walked back into the kitchen. That's when I saw him. He was outside, standing beside the garden ring. I stopped in the middle of the room, my hand still on the last button. I'd told him to stay inside. He'd nodded, slouched at the table, looking drained, and now he was out there, maybe 10 feet from the river rocks, just staring at the flat gray stone and the white saucer sitting on it. I went out the back door without a jacket. The drizzle had turned to a fine, cold mist, the kind that hangs in the air and soaks you through without you noticing. The storm darkness was thick now, a purple gloom that made the woods look like a painted backdrop. I walked across the wet grass, my boots squelching. Caleb. He didn't turn. He was just standing there, his hands at his sides, his head tilted like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. I told you to stay inside, I said, my voice sharp in the quiet. He blinked slowly and looked at me. His face was blank, confused. I don't know how I got out here. You walked. No, he said, shaking his head. I was at the table. I remember the table. Then I was here. I looked at the ground between him and the house. No tracks in the wet grass but mine. He was inside the garden's boundary, past the scattered river rocks I hadn't finished resetting. I'd left him alone for maybe 20 minutes, just long enough to gather the rocks and wrestle the slate halves into their holes. Long enough. "Come on," I said, reaching for his arm. "Back to the house." He let me pull him, his steps sluggish, reluctant. I kept hold of his elbow as we walked away from the ring. The light was fading fast, the day bleeding out into that deep, unnatural twilight. I glanced back over my shoulder at the stone circle. The two broken slate halves, the ones I'd packed with mud, were leaning farther out of the ground than they had been 10 minutes ago. They weren't falling over. They were rising, pressing upward against the wet earth I'd tamped around them. And the saucer on the gray stone, the buttermilk and honey I'd just put out, was steaming. A faint, visible warmth rose from its surface into the cold air. Neither of us had touched it. We made it to the back porch. I sat him down on the top step. "Stay," I said, the word coming out harder than I meant it. "Don't move." He nodded, pulling his knees up to his chest, and stared out at the garden. I stood beside him, one hand on the porch rail, watching the ring. The slate slabs kept tilting, inch by slow inch. The saucer kept steaming. The silence was absolute, a weight pressing down on the hollow. Time got strange. The gray light didn't change, but I could feel it getting later. My watch said 6:42. I looked away from the garden for a second, just to rub a hand over my face. And when I looked back, Caleb was gone. He was walking toward the center of the ring. He moved the same way he had the night before. Slow, dreamlike, his feet bare again, though he'd had shoes on a minute ago. His lips were moving, whispering. I bolted down the steps, my boots skidding in the wet grass. "Caleb!" He didn't hear me. He stepped over the river rocks, into the circle. And that's when I saw them. Between the two leaning slate doors, where the gaps were, the ground was bulging. Not like something pushing up from below, but like something unfolding. Low, jointed shapes were rising, dark against the darker earth. They were made of root and slate and wet clay, knotted together in a way that looked both deliberate and blind. They had limbs, but the limbs folded backward at the joints, moving in a slow, rustling crawl as they pulled themselves free of the soil. They gathered along the inside of the ring, facing inward toward Caleb, who was now standing on the gray stone itself. Ruby's words echoed in my head. "They take a living member of the household to make the count even." The offering wasn't enough. It never had been. A broken boundary needed more than food. It needed weight, living weight. I didn't think. I just moved. I ran into the ring, the river rocks scraping under my boots, and grabbed Caleb around the chest. He was lighter than he should have been, limp as a doll. I hauled him backward, away from the stone, away from the gathering shapes. They didn't cross the circle. They stayed inside it, their root and clay bodies shifting, turning to follow our movement. I got Caleb past the river rocks, onto the grass. He slumped against me, his eyes half closed. "Bernard," he mumbled. "It's okay," I said, though it wasn't. "Stay here." The shapes were waiting. The slate doors were fully upright now, standing straight in their holes like they'd never been broken. The ring was closed, complete, and it was hungry. I looked at Caleb, at his pale, scared face, at the faint circle of marks on his ankles. He was 16. He was my sister's kid. He was the person I'd driven down here to protect. I'd let the damaged ring sit for a day. I'd dismissed the signs. I'd brought him into this. I turned back to the circle. "Caleb," I said, my voice rough. "Don't follow me." "What?" I stepped over the river rocks. The shapes rustled, turning toward me. I walked to the center, stood on the flat gray stone. The saucer of buttermilk was cold now, the steam gone. I looked at the low, jointed things watching me from the edges of the ring. I said my name aloud, clear into the heavy air. "Bernard Alexander." Then I said, "Thank you." The shapes closed around me. They didn't cross the boundary. They just filled it, their root and slate limbs folding around my legs, my waist, cool and gritty and impossibly strong. Caleb screamed my name. I saw him lunge toward the river rocks, his hands reaching for me. "Stay outside," I yelled at him, the last thing I got out before the ground beneath the stone gave way. It wasn't a collapse. It was an opening. The slate doors sealed overhead with a sound like stone kissing stone, and the wet soil swallowed me down. The shapes pulled, and I went, down into the dark and the cold and the weight. I don't know how long it was. There was pressure, and a deep, root-tangled smell, and then nothing. I came to on the back porch. The storm was over. The sky was clear and black, salted with stars. I was sitting on the top step, my back against the house siding. My clothes were dry. My feet were bare. I stood up, my legs shaky, and looked at the garden. The ring was silent. The gray stone sat in the center, the saucer empty and clean beside it. The river rocks were in their circle. The two slate doors stood upright, whole, as if they'd never been cracked. There was no sign of the shapes, no sign of Bernard. I walked inside. The kitchen was dark, the only light from the moon through the window over the sink. Bernard's phone, wallet, and boots were arranged neatly beside the pantry door, like he'd taken them off and set them there before going out. But I'd seen him. He'd been wearing those boots when he stepped into the ring. I picked up the phone. The screen lit up. No signal. No outgoing calls after his last attempt to reach Ruby. Just the time. 7:10 p.m. I put the phone down. I stood there in the quiet kitchen, listening to the old house settle around me, and waited for something to happen. Nothing did. The storm passed sometime in the night. I heard the rain stop, the wind die down, and then there was just the hollow sound of water dripping off the eaves. I waited on the porch steps until the sky went from black to that deep, washed-out gray, the kind that comes just before dawn. Then I stood up, my joints stiff, and walked down to the road. The low-water crossing was passable. The floodwater had dropped back into the creek bed, leaving the concrete slab slick with mud but clear. The big tree that had fallen behind us was still there, but it had shifted, rolling a few feet to the side and leaving enough room to squeeze a truck through. My truck was right where I'd left it, sitting dead in the middle of the crossing. The driver's side door was still open, the interior light long since drained. The water had receded from the doors, leaving a tide line of silt and leaves halfway up the tires. I waded out. The water was cold, ankle deep, and the current tugged lightly at my legs. I climbed into the driver's seat. The key was still in the ignition. I turned it. Nothing. Not a click, not a groan. The dash was dark. I tried it 3 more times, my hand getting slick on the plastic. Nothing. The engine was just a block of wet metal. I got back out, the door groaning on its hinges, and stood there in the mud. Bernard wasn't in the cab. He wasn't in the bed. He wasn't anywhere on the road. The only tracks were mine, coming back from the house. The walk back took longer. The dawn light was stronger now, a pale silver filtering through the trees. I went straight to the garden. The ring was whole. Not patched, not shaky, but perfect. The river rocks were set in a tight, even circle. The 2 slate doors stood upright in their holes, smooth and unbroken, their surfaces dark with damp. There was no V-shaped gap between them. They looked like they'd never been cracked. And in the center, where the flat gray stone should have been, was a different stone. It was the same size, the same shape, but it was whole. No fracture lines. It looked new, or maybe just forgotten. On top of it, arranged neatly side by side, were Bernard's phone, his brown leather wallet, and his work boots. The boots were clean, laced, the soles free of mud. They were placed with the toes pointing toward the house, like he'd taken them off and set them there before stepping away. I didn't go into the circle. I just stood at the edge, looking at those three things sitting on the stone. The ring felt quiet, settled, like a door that had been firmly shut. I went inside. The kitchen was cold, the way an empty house gets in the early morning. I walked to the pantry and opened the door. The card was still taped to the inside. The 3 Alexander names were there, with their old dates. But the 4th line, the one that had said my name and today's date and even weight, it was gone. Not crossed out, not erased, just absent. The paper below it was blank, a little yellower than the rest, as if that space had never held any writing at all. No new name had been added. The debt column was empty. The tally was back to 3. I closed the pantry door. The latch clicked, loud in the quiet. I went back outside. The sun was just cresting the ridge now, throwing long, sharp shadows across the garden. The ring sat in a pool of that new light, the slate doors gleaming. I walked over to the gray stone. The saucer was still there, beside Bernard's things. But the buttermilk and honey were gone. The saucer was full of something else. It was red, a deep, translucent red like cranberry juice. And it was warm. I could see a faint steam rising from its surface into the cool air. It didn't smell like anything, just warm. I didn't touch it. I didn't touch the phone or the wallet or the boots. I just stood there, looking at the closed circle, at the offering that had been accepted and replaced, at the empty space where a person should have been. The house behind me was silent. The woods were silent. The hollow was holding its breath. I turned and walked away. I didn't go back inside. I walked past the porch, down the gravel drive to the county road. The sky was clear now, a hard, bright blue. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. I started walking, my sneakers crunching on the gravel, and I didn't look back. I just put one foot in front of the other, heading for the main road, leaving the ring closed behind me, whole and quiet and paid.